Dollar. Dirt and money, no soul. Had to go and get it, ain't no time to kick it. Got a stack of flip for my foes. Dollar. Please tell me you can hear me. Don't turn your back and don't neglect me. Just let me know if you need me. Dollar. Let me watch out for my partners. Keep my money long, get my team strong. Let me run away from my problems.
Yep, what's good, original crew, man? We're back today, man. Yes, sir, we're back with another Mr. Ballen. We fly high, no lie, and you know it's
Ballen. I know, like, stop. I told you.
Ballen. Stop. I know somebody else said it with me, man.
Yeah.
But today we got top 3 places you can't go, but people went anyways. Episode 25, 01. I don't know why is it like that. Oh, he probably forgot. No, why is it? I don't know. Oh, January 2025. I guess I don't know. Because the 25 and then the 01 don't make sense. But dying from the thin. I don't know what that could mean either.
Yeah.
You see, you got it too.
Yeah.
I bet you by the time we put this out, he changed the title again. I bet you in a minute, money. But hey, with that being said, before we get into it, make sure you check out the links in the description box.
Down below.
You already know where to go. If you want the first part, you got to do is check out down below. Also, if you enjoyed today's visuals,
like it on a thumbs up.
But hey, man, with that being said, let's go ahead and get into it. Let's check it out. Let's see what it's about. You ready?
I'm ready.
Let's go, y'all.
Today, we're going to look at 3 places you can't go and people who went there anyways. Today, we're going to look at 3 places you can't go and people who went there anyways. But before we get into those stories, if you're a fan of Strange, Dark, and Mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do and we upload once a week. So if that's of interest to you, please steal the like button's mail and take all the money their grandmother sent them for their birthday. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's stories. Around 11:30 a.m. on August 14th, 2005, 2 Greek military fighter pilots flew in their jets high above Athens, Greece, following behind a Boeing 737 commercial airplane. This commercial airplane was Helios Airways Flight 522. It had left Cyprus at 9 a.m. that morning with 121 people on board, and it was scheduled to have landed in Athens 45 minutes earlier. But instead, shortly after takeoff, Flight 522's pilots had stopped responding to air traffic control, and now the plane was just circling right over the city. And so at some point, the military became concerned that perhaps Flight 522 had been hijacked, and at some point, the hijackers were going to crash the plane into a city. And so in response to that, they had sent up these 2 fighter pilots to see what was going on. Now, when the 2 fighter pilots arrived on station in the air right behind Flight 522, at first, they couldn't tell what the issue was. There was no fire or visible smoke or any damage to the aircraft. And so the 2 fighter pilots in tandem flew up alongside the plane so they could look inside the windows. And when they did, and they saw inside to the actual fuselage, they saw all the oxygen masks were dropped down in front of the passengers, and all the passengers had the masks on. However, all the passengers were passed out. They were slumped over with these masks strapped to their faces. Now, the fighter pilots had no idea if these passengers were unconscious or dead or some combination, but for right now, all they cared about was, are the pilots conscious and able to fly this craft? And so the 2 fighter pilots flew up until they were parallel with the cockpit, and they looked in the window, and they saw not the pilots. They saw the oxygen mask drop down, but the pilots were not there. Instead, they saw this one guy who was clearly not a pilot. He was not in a pilot's uniform, looking out the window at them, just waving, just some random guy. And so the 2 fighter pilots had no idea what to make of this. Before the fighter pilots could even begin to react to whatever was going on here, this random guy in the cockpit looked out at one of the fighter pilots and just began gesturing down with his index finger, and then a moment later, Flight 522 began to descend. To fully understand what happens next, we need to go back to just before 9 a.m. on the same morning. So 9 a.m. was takeoff, and right before, the crew of Flight 522 did their routine safety checks of the aircraft, and they determined that the craft was ready for takeoff. However, they had actually missed one crucial thing. There was a knob on this aircraft that was switched to the wrong setting by a maintenance person right before takeoff, and nobody had noticed, so it wasn't put back to where it needed to be. And so Flight 522 wound up taking off on schedule, and at first, everything was fine, totally normal. But about 2 minutes into the flight, all these alarms began sounding on the aircraft, and then the oxygen mask dropped from the ceiling. And the reason for that is that knob that had been set to the wrong setting controlled how much breathable air was in the aircraft during flight. It basically had been switched to off. So there was nothing to breathe in the airplane. And so by the time these masks were dropping down, people on the plane were already passing out, including the pilots. They were passed out pretty much immediately when those masks came down. And so it's absolutely chaos in this plane. Everybody's passing out, except for one person, 25-year-old flight attendant Andreas Prodromo, who when the masks came down, he was awake, he was conscious, and instead of grabbing one of those masks from the overhead, he managed to connect himself to one of the emergency oxygen tanks. Now, the reason that's very important is the masks that drop down on an aircraft have a very limited supply of oxygen. But Andreas, who was actually training to be a pilot, was aware of that, and he put on this emergency oxygen tank, which had way more oxygen to it. And so suddenly he's breathing a much longer air source, and he's looking around the plane, and everybody's passed out except for him. Now, we don't know at what point he learned this, but at some point, Andreas would have noticed, as he's breathing on this emergency oxygen tank, that out the window, he would see the plane is just flying in circles. And it would have dawned on him that not only are the passengers out, but very likely so are the pilots. And so literally, there's nobody flying this plane. And so he had a decision to make. Either he was going to just sit here until the plane crashed, or he was going to do something, like try to fly the plane. And that's what he ultimately decided to do. And so Andreas stood up, he took his oxygen tank, and he headed into the cockpit. And after moving aside the unconscious pilots, he attempted to fly this plane. And so the two fighter pilots who flew up alongside the cockpit and looked in and saw that one random guy who was waving to them, that was Andreas. And unfortunately, despite the fact that Andreas was training to become a pilot, he was not remotely qualified or skilled enough to fly a big Boeing 737. He had no idea how to fly this aircraft. And making the situation even worse is very shortly after Andreas entered the cockpit, the plane ran out of fuel. And so it left its automatic holding pattern that it had been in, flying in circles, and just automatically began trying to descend. But that required pilot input to land the plane. But Andreas knew he couldn't possibly land this plane successfully. And so as the plane automatically began its descent down towards Athens, this huge city full of people, Andreas did the one thing he could do. He took one last look at one of the fighter pilots outside the window, and he gestured to them that the plane was now beginning to descend. And then Andreas, he grabbed the yoke of the aircraft, and he intentionally banked it to the left, basically flying the plane away from Athens, and he guided this plane into an unpopulated hillside where it crashed. Andreas and all 120 people on that plane all died in the crash. However, because of Andreas's heroic final act of steering the plane away from Athens, not a single person on the ground was hurt.
Damn, bro.
That's sad.
That's beyond sad, bro. I mean... Damn.
It's the first story.
That's fucked up. You know? I mean, golly, bro. Like...
Not only was so much, everything that could have went wrong. Went wrong.
And it's just... It's... Luckily, he did get the oxygen.
Yeah. Quick thinking. I know this only holds a little. Let me at least do all I can.
He knew. Like, this bad.
This is not going to possibly end well.
And good, quick thinking, unfortunately, did cost everyone's life. But it could have cost way more lives. You know? Damn, bro. I don't even got words to explain. It's crazy.
A single person on the ground was hurt. On the evening of February 1st, 2009, a 32-year-old man named Luo Jinfa stood in the doorway of his apartment in Taiwan, waiting for his landlord to finish lecturing him about being late on his rent. Luo had just moved into this apartment 2 months earlier in December. And this was not a very nice apartment. It was a cramped downstairs unit with no air conditioning, so it was really sweaty and awful in there most of the time, but it was all Luo could afford. He wasn't working right now and knew this was the best he was going to get. As the landlord continued to berate Luo about how he was totally within his rights to evict Luo if he didn't pay him, how he'd already given Luo an extension, and what's going on here, you got to get your act together. As all that was happening, Luo just was totally quiet and just was waiting for the landlord to be quiet. Because at this point, Luo didn't really care about the rent side of this discussion. He just wanted his landlord to be quiet so he could ask him a very strange but important question. And finally, after about 5 minutes of the landlord just ranting, the landlord stopped for a second to try to calculate how much interest he could potentially charge Luo. And as the landlord began scribbling notes on his notepad, Luo saw his opportunity. And he said, "Excuse me, I don't mean to interrupt, but I actually need to ask you something." And the landlord was sort of caught off guard by the way Luo was approaching him. The landlord thought he was intimidating Luo, so the idea that Luo was now gonna, interrupt him and go a different direction with this conversation felt sort of disrespectful. But the landlord looked at Luo like, "What question could you possibly have?" And Luo just said, "Do you know if anyone's been murdered inside of my apartment?" After Luo asked the question, the landlord just stared at Luo like he didn't really know how to process this question at all. But then after a moment, this look of shock disappeared, and once again, the landlord was just annoyed with Luo and said, "You know what? I know what's wrong with you, but I'll be back in a month and you better have your rent." And then the landlord just turned around and walked away without answering Luo's question. Now, Luo was pretty stressed out about paying the rent. I mean, he had no money and had no idea how he was going to pay his landlord in a month. But the much more pressing issue in Luo's life were the very strange things happening inside of his apartment, which is what prompted him to ask that strange question to his landlord. And so not getting an answer to that question just made this whole situation that much more stressful for Luo. And so after the landlord disappeared down the hall, Luo kind of hesitantly turned back around and went back inside his apartment and shut the door, and immediately he just felt terrified. 1 month later, on March 2nd, 2009, a day after the rent was due, Luo's landlord had still not received rent from Luo. And so he spent that entire day, March 2nd, calling Luo, trying to get him on the phone to be like, "Where's my money?" But Luo wasn't answering his phone. And so eventually the landlord went to Luo's apartment and knocked on the door. Eventually, when Luo didn't come to the door, the landlord just used his own key to let himself in. Now, the landlord didn't really know what to expect when he walked inside of Luo's apartment. All he knew was that Luo was kind of a weird guy, and he certainly wasn't paying rent, and his general impression of Luo was definitely a bad one. And so he kind of expected the apartment to reflect the negative things he thought about Luo. But when he stepped in there, even the landlord was shocked at what he saw. I mean, the apartment was in total disarray. Furniture was all over the place and stacked up against the walls in weird arrangements. And there were all these bottles of empty alcohol all over the place. There was a freezer that Luo had moved to the middle of the living room floor. I mean, the place just was a total mess and just kind of all over the place. But the thing that really creeped the landlord out the second he walked in there was that all over the walls were these yellow and red pieces of paper with prayers written on them that had been stabbed into the wall with individual knives. Like Luo had taken a prayer and stabbed it to the wall over and over and over again, all over the apartment. Now, the landlord had no idea what to make of any of this. He just knew he was done with Luo. He was evicting him. And so he quickly searched the apartment just to make sure Luo was not really in here. And he wasn't. The apartment was empty. And so after that, the landlord just left the apartment. He locked the apartment. He went and got a new lock at the hardware store, came back, replaced the lock, and was determined to never let Luo ever come back. And in fact, Luo would not come back. The landlord never had to worry about, telling Luo to stay away. He just never came back. And for months, Luo's old apartment just sat empty. Fast forward 7 months after the landlord went inside of Luo's apartment, and the landlord's brother approached the landlord and said, "Hey, can I rent out that apartment? No one's using it." And the landlord said that was fine, but the brother would have to clean up the apartment because nobody had touched it since Luo had lived there. So a couple of days later, on October 18th, the landlord's brother, along with the landlord, met at Luo's apartment. They went inside and they totally cleaned it out. Basically all the furniture and the lamps and everything in there, some of Luo's old clothes and things he had left behind. They took it all out of the apartment and they loaded it into a truck and they drove to a nearby recycling facility where they sold whatever they could and then dumped the rest, and then they left. However, when the workers at the recycling facility began processing some of the junk that had been left behind by the landlord and the brother, they made a discovery that immediately made them stop and contact the police. It would turn out Luo had not actually abandoned his apartment. In fact, he had never left his apartment. So Luo had become totally convinced that his apartment was haunted by a ghost. At night, he would hear walking around above him, even though he knew nobody actually occupied the apartment right above him. And so the footsteps didn't make any sense. And then sometimes he would claim that he would see these shadowy figures wandering around inside of his apartment. Now, it's worth noting that Luo did have mental health issues and he was a drug user, but he was absolutely adamant to the people he spoke to that there was something strange happening inside of his apartment. And so he began to wonder if, maybe somebody had been murdered in his apartment and their ghost was now haunting him. Hence the question to his landlord. And so this haunting, or whatever it was, just continued night after night, day after day for Luo, and it was driving him absolutely mad. But Luo discovered there was actually one place he could go in his apartment that would sort of protect him from whatever was happening inside of there. And that was to lock himself inside of his bedroom. However, his bedroom was not a real room. His bedroom was that big freezer the landlord found sitting in the middle of his living room. Luo had been climbing in there and shutting it to protect himself from this entity at night.
Yeah.
Don't tell me he was in there, right? And the landlord locked it when he searched for him. Don't tell me that happened. And this whole time he probably was been trying to get out. Because in a deep freezer, I don't know. I ain't never been in one. He might not heard him at the door. He might not. He probably sleep. He probably not been able to get any sleep. And he was locked in there. Never been able to get up. No.
But he would always prop the lid open just enough so that air could come in and out of there because it was airtight. However, shortly after Luo's conversation with his landlord about being late on rent, Luo had gone back inside his apartment, gotten really drunk, climbed inside of his bedroom, shut the lid, and forgot to prop it open. And so as he lay there, he slowly suffocated to death because there wasn't any circulation. And after he died inside of his freezer, nobody found him. And then 7 months later, after Luo's landlord and his brother emptied out Luo's apartment, they brought that freezer along with everything else to the recycling facility where the workers there would open up the freezer and they would find Luo.
That's horrible. That's absolutely horrible.
Wow. I wonder, was it airtight where
it closed?
And he was so drunk, he passed out.
Yeah.
And basically he died in his sleep.
Basically.
Wow.
That's sad.
Unbelievable.
And then not to be...
And then we still don't get the answer if somebody died in there before he did.
Still don't have that answer.
That's freaking sad.
I don't know if he... Or I guess not. He must not have any family or anything. Especially for no one to check on you for 7 months.
But also, certain cultures, boys, once they get to a certain age, they want you know what I'm saying? So, possibly, even though he might got family, they probably... it's hard to explain certain cultures, but certain cultures be hard on kids and hard on family. And
I ain't saying you can't be hard, but I'm saying don't nobody, hey, check in, call, hey, how you doing?
Certain cultures won't do.
I hear you. I got that. I
Some
understand
cultures
every culture is different.
Go years without even speaking to each other. That's a possibility too, but
no, that's sad though.
7 months.
I'd be so traumatized to have to like for the workers that found him.
Opening it.
Oh yeah.
And all that flesh is just sitting in there. The odor,
the smell.
Oh my! Y'all didn't. And how y'all give away a deep freezer? Y'all ain't
never looked in it. Even when he went to check the apartment to see if he was in there and everything is just out of order and you just close it up for 7 months and leave it like it is. I mean, whatever. It's not his apartment.
What country was he in?
I don't remember.
I don't think he said.
He probably. I don't know. I didn't write it down.
February to October, he was in a deep freezer, right? Hot months. Mm-hmm. The apartment hot. It's already hot in the deep freezer. Unless it was plugged up. But I doubt it was plugged up and connected because he was sleeping in it.
Yeah, because he was sleeping.
Damn, that's a horrible way to go, man. And the after effect of it. It's horrible, man.
On August 4th, 2019, a 28-year-old man named Sombora left his farm in rural Cambodia and headed off into the jungle. His goal that day was to climb the nearby Chakrai mountain and try to harvest as much bat guano as possible. So bat guano is bat poop, and it makes excellent fertilizer. And in the jungles of Cambodia, there are all these mountains, including Chakrai Mountain, that have these cave systems full of bats. So it's a great place to go looking for bat guano. And Sum and his family, they would go out there and harvest as much as they could in order to support their farm. This is kind of like their main business. And so on this particular day, Sum was not just going to climb this mountain and go into random caves and hope for the best. Today, his mission was to go to one cave in particular that he knew had a ton of bat guano inside of it, mostly because the other people in the area that went out harvesting bat guano, they wouldn't go into this cave. And the reason for that is the cave was really, really narrow and tight and frankly dangerous because of it. And so they didn't go into it. But Sum was a very slight guy with a narrow frame. And so he could basically get himself into tight spaces and reap the benefits of places like this cave. And so after hiking for about an hour through the jungle and then up this mountain, Sum finally reached the entrance to this particular cave. And it was an opening that was about 3 feet by 3 feet, and you really couldn't see very far into it. But Sum knew what he was doing, and pretty much immediately got down on his stomach. He got his flashlight out, he took his guano bag, which had a long strap coming off of it so he could drag it behind him, and he began wriggling his way into this opening. Now, the way this cave system roughly worked is there was this narrow entrance that went kind of straight ahead like a tunnel, but then periodically, as it continued along, there'd be these kind of like pockets, these openings, where it would get big enough where Sum could actually get up onto his hands and knees and kind of move around a little bit. And it was inside of these pockets, these caverns, where all the bats would be. And that's where most of their poop was. And so all Sum was trying to do as soon as he went inside this cave is get to these caverns and then do his harvesting. And so Sum, he wriggled his way forward, he got through that first tunnel section, and he entered the first cavern. And sure enough, there were quite a few bats on the ceiling, and there was all this bat guano, about a pound of bat guano. And so he scooped it all up, he put it into his bag, and then he kept on moving through the tunnel into the next cavern. And as he was making his way down that second stretch of tunnel, shining his light ahead, he saw what looked like the walls moving up ahead when he was looking into the next cavern. But he knew that was not actually the wall moving. There was a whole bunch of bats in this next cavern. And so from his perspective, it seemed like there were way more bats in that cavern than this one. And so in theory, this next cavern was going to have a ton of bat guano, potentially all he would need for this entire journey. He could just pack his bag and leave after this next cavern. However, there was a small problem. Now, Sum had come to this spot many times before, and he knew that going from the first cavern to the next cavern had a little bit of a hiccup. On the ground, as you cross the threshold into this second cavern, was a crack in the ground that basically ran perpendicular to the way this tunnel ran. Now, the crack was only about 6 inches wide, but when you were over it shining a light down into this crack, it was like it went on forever. It was like this unending hole in the earth. And so Sum always just got creeped out climbing over this crack because there was really no way to go around it. You really had to go right over the top of it because all he was thinking about is like, what's down inside of this deep hole in this cave? It's reminiscent of how people are scared of really deep oceans, like thalassophobia. It's fear of what's down there. And so Sum just really didn't like it. But again, he knew there was going to be a ton of bat poop if he could just cross over that crack, and so it was worth it. And so Sum, he wriggled his way through the tunnel, he reached the crack, he kind of shined his light down and again saw just this never-ending pit that just shot straight down into the earth. But Sum took a deep breath, and he wriggled over the top of it successfully. And after he crossed it and he was about to enter into the cavern to get this huge bat guano payload, he felt something tugging on him, and immediately he was terrified and he whipped his head around wondering what could possibly be grabbing him. When he realized nothing was grabbing him, it was his guano bag that he dragged behind him with that big strap. It had gotten stuck on the crack itself. Sum was immediately relieved because he had really hyped up the idea that maybe there was some monster behind him or something, but there wasn't, and so he just kind of grabbed his strap and kind of jimmied the bag out of the crack. But as he did, he lost his flashlight. So he's moving the bag and he kind of fumbles the flashlight, and the flashlight rolled backwards into the crack. And as soon as this happens, Sum is watching with horror as he's seeing the light kind of jostling around as it tumbles down into the crack. But then it comes to a stop. Like it didn't just fall endlessly into the earth, it got wedged at some point, and the light from the flashlight was actually shining straight up. So it was pretty near the surface. And so Sum's thinking to himself,
reaching down, picking it up.
No.
Fuck that.
Forget that flashlight. And
But I know you probably need it to be able to do what you always come double prepared.
Yeah, I was thinking, yeah. Other than that, baby, I'm going to have to figure it out.
okay, that's bad. I can't lose my flashlight. I have to be able to see to get the bat poop and to get out of here. But let me just turn around and I'll reach into that horrible crack and I'll get my flashlight and everything will be okay. And so Sum carefully backed back down across the crack. And when he was looking straight down into the crack, he could see the flashlight. And it was wedged, pointing straight up, maybe 1.5 feet or 2 feet down. Now, Sum did not want to reach his arm into this crack for all the reasons he was scared of the crack. Like, he doesn't know what's down there, but he really needs his flashlight. And so Sum kind of backed himself up and mentally prepared himself and then reached into the crack and began blindly reaching down, hoping to grab this flashlight and yank it out as fast as he could. But as he reached, he couldn't quite get to the flashlight. And so he began turning and twisting his body and forcing his shoulder deeper and deeper until finally he could touch the flashlight. And then finally, right as he grabbed the flashlight, something happened. That night, Sum did not return to his farm. Now, his family was not actually that worried about it because it was not uncommon for Sum to go out on these guano foraging adventures and be gone for, a couple days at a time. However, after another 2 days went by and still Sum had not returned, his family started to get worried. And so ultimately, Sum's brother decided to go out and look for him. Sum's brother had often collected guano with Sum in the past, and so he knew roughly where Sum liked to go, including Sum's favorite spot, that cave up in the mountain. And so when the brother went out looking for him, pretty quickly he found himself in that favorite spot. Now, Sum's brother was about the same size as Sum, and so he too could navigate this very tight tunnel. And so that's what he did. He got down on his stomach, he had his flashlight out, and he yelled into the cave for Sum, but there was no answer. And so he eventually made his way to that first cavern. He didn't find Sum. He kept going, and right as he was about to hit that second cavern, as he shined his light ahead, he saw there was a bag on the ground, and it was his brother's guano bag. And so he knew his brother had to have come here, and he began yelling out for his brother, but there was no answer. And then right as the brother paused for a second just to listen, he heard a faint cry, a human cry. And he called out, like, "Is that you, Sum?" And again, he heard another cry. But he's looking around and he can't see Sum anywhere. And so the brother just continues shimmying his way towards that second cavern. And right as he begins to cross over that crack, he hears the cry again, and it's coming from right below him. It's coming from the crack. And the brother takes his flashlight and shines it straight down into that crack. And there, in the crack, was Sum. He was wedged all the way inside of the crack. It would turn out, a few days earlier, when Sum was in this cave reaching for his flashlight, he couldn't quite get his fingers around the flashlight. And so he kept turning his body more and more until his body was parallel with the crack itself. And then finally, right as he's leaning down and he gets his hands on the flashlight, he rolled and fell into the crack. His whole body basically perfectly fit into the crack, and down he went several feet where he wedged into the crack. And then once he was wedged down there was nowhere to go. He was absolutely trapped. And so Sum laid in this crack for days, having no expectation he was going to get out. He was totally wedged, no food, no water. He was going to die, and he knew it. In fact, he actively wished he had a knife on hand so he could take his own life. But luckily for Sum, his brother would find him, his brother would go and get help, and on the 4th day of Sum being trapped inside of this crack, rescuers were able to pull him out, and he would make a full recovery.
Oh my. Yo.
I'm going to play you a clip from one of...
Finally. Out of all these cave
I needed
joints,
that.
we finally got somebody who was rescued, and a lot. Bro, I'll get tired of hearing about the caves.
I needed that because I said, here we go, another cave story. And I hate how they end because it's never good.
Facts, man. Facts. And all these stories, the person dies.
I know.
And soon he survives. Shout out to Strength, man.
Facts.
And shout out to his brother.
Shout out to his brother, bro.
Man, I mean, golly, bro. These stories was crazy. First story, the flight. Oh my gosh, bro. Immediately, as soon as they went up, they pass out.
You know, as as devastating as that situation is, especially for, I didn't write his name down.
It's Andres or something like that. Something like that.
Like, he honestly, like, thinking about it, because I'm trying to, like, you know, find the positive in it in a sense. Which is not positive for him, but he would have been the only one to actually, like, feel it, because everybody else was, like, passed out already, you know what I'm saying? Not saying you can't feel things when you passed out, but I'm just saying, like, everybody else is passed out when the crash happened. It is devastating, but I was just trying to find, like, just a little piece of, like,
positive.
Yeah,
life.
It's horrible however you look at it, because so many people lost their lives. But I was just like, dang. And then the second story, that one's horrible. And then he already, like before even his demise, already going through it mentally, you know, thinking he's hearing things and seeing things and whatever the case.
I wonder, was it the paranoia from all that? Could have been his paranoia from drinking, especially if he was like a heavy alcoholic, you know?
Yeah.
Because if you're a heavy alcoholic, that's could possibly happen.
Yeah.
Where you're freaking out about things that are not even there.
True. Don't know with that one.
Yeah.
But with the last one.
Good positive ending.
Yeah.
Good way to end it, Mr. Ballen. You did it. You gave us a positive ending.
He had to suffer for 4 days, but he still got his life.
Because that one, honestly, I thought the way that one looked, I was like, ain't no way they'll be able to get him out.
I know. I was like, how they gonna get him out? Because will he be able to, like, grab onto it? And then how would you actually
like
pull him out? Because he wedged in between. Like, I don't know. But
and then if you chisel, you might mess up and open the bottom. And then really, you know.
I do wonder how but kudos to the team, rescue team for being able to get him out.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
But, hey, man, y'all spam us up in the comments, man. Let us know y'all thoughts about it for us in the comment section down below. But until next time, y'all know how it go, man. I do go by the name DJ New Kid. This is
Sierra Nicole.
We are.
Kid and C.
We are.
Peace.
Time to kick it, got a stack of flip for my foes. Dollar. Please tell me you can hear me. Don't turn your back and don't neglect me. Just let me know if you need me. Dollar. Let me watch out for my partner.